Hi, Mage fans. This is your host, Terry Robinson with Mage the Podcast. In this episode, we talk with Steve Dempsey, the author of Fearful Symmetries, which is a Trail of Cthulhu expansion about the cosmology of William Blake in the backdrop of the United Kingdom in the 1930s. It includes a lot of information on the cosmology of Blake, which you can just dump into a Mage game, as well as magical societies that were active early in the previous century. I think a lot of this is stealable for Mage, and there are copious show notes. Steve was very generous with the amount of time he gave us, and this is a heavily cut down conversation. And I think it was 2 a.m. his time when we spoke with him. So once again, thank you, Steve, so much. After about an hour, Bryce and I then talk about how to apply these ideas more directly to a game of Mage. If this format works for you, great, as it lets us talk to an expert without having to interrupt them constantly about how to add whatever they're talking about to Mage. If it doesn't, give us a holler. There is a poll in the Spotify entry for this show, or drop us a line on the Discord. And with that, on with the show. Hi, Mage fans. This is your host, Terry Robinson with Mage the Podcast. Joining me today is my co-host, Bryce. Say hi, Bryce.
Hi, Bryce.
As well as Steve Dempsey. Steve Dempsey is an author for Pelgrane Press, as well as, I presume, other games and game publications. And today we are going to talk about Fearful Symmetries, a book that takes place in the 1930s UK and focuses on the myth and mythology and works of William Blake and how they possibly interface with the mythos. Steve, thank you so much for joining us. And how you doing?
Hello, I'm doing very well, thanks, today. And it's just great to be here.
How did you get into RPG writing?
It's quite a long road for me. So I wrote my first games before I was 10. The first game I wrote was a sort of table tennis variant played with a football. The road outside our house was split into big slabs, and so it looked like a tennis court, so I made this game. My brother and I got books. We got books from the local library about soldiers from the Second World War. Somebody had given us a load of tiny little inch-tall soldiers. They were 6 inches to a foot, kind of. And so we got all the weapons information and we wrote some wargame rules. We had a problem because we were using the ranges from the books, and the ranges were enormous, and we didn't think, because the soldiers were that large, that we could use a different range, a different size for the ranges than we did for the soldiers. So the only place we could play it was in the back garden. And we wrote a battleship variant, which we called Pirates, where both of you drew a treasure map, a hidden treasure map, which had tigers and pits and quicksand and guns and lianas. And you made this map up with this on, and you traipsed around each other's map. You called out locations of where you were and where you were going to next, and you found things there and used them to buy other things, and you got the treasure. But then, in the late 70s, I discovered AD&D. I was living in France then, which was a bit difficult, but there was a French magazine called Jeux et Stratégie, which issue number 4 had a big thing about role-playing in it. But that got me into AD&D. I wrote a massive campaign, essentially a sandbox campaign, which I ran in France when I was there, and when I came back to the UK to go to university, I ran it in the UK as well, and it lasted about 4 years at university. And I still wasn't writing for anybody else except for myself. But one of my friends started writing for the British Isles Traveller Support Group, and I wrote one single creature for a book. That was my first publication. And then Pelgrane Press, who published Gumshoe, their first game was Dying Earth, and they put out a call for authors to write a Dying Earth game. And so I thought I'd give it a go. I wrote a game. I ran it at Gen Con in 1999. They gave the contract to some guy called Robin Laws, who I'd never heard of, but turns out he's actually pretty good at writing games. But the other thing I discovered was I only lived 4 miles from Simon Rogers, who owns Pelgrane Press. We started gaming together. We play tested Dying Earth. I wrote a load of freebies for their website, a load of small adventures. I've been sort of writing for Pelgrane ever since. A lot of Gumshoe stuff. And occasionally, my wife writes gaming material as well. In fact, she's the one with the Ennie. I've never won an Ennie on my own. I've run bits of Ennies because I've contributed to books by Robin Laws and Ken Hite, who regularly win such things. We've written for Magpie Games, who wrote something for Urban Shadows, the London supplement, and I wrote for Cthulhu Britannica London box set for Cubicle 7. It's got quite a lot of my material in, including a write-up of John Dee, some fiction. And that's essentially my way into gaming, through friends and just writing lots of stuff.
you've worked on something involving John Dee. You are automatically a member of the magetheascension extended community. Thank him for his work inventing Enochian, which is wonderful to have something that you can just run with without it somehow being secretly anti-Semitic, which is seemingly what happens with every other magical conspiracy. I also like your comment on it's big in France, but no one else has ever heard of it, because every time I hear about the French role-playing world, that seems to be the repeated phrase.
Yeah. I'm actually involved in a group who are putting together a podcast about French role playing for English people.
Nice. What's it like having art credits shared with William Blake?
Yes, that's amazing. My mum is actually a professional artist, and I'm sure she's very proud of me. The Fearful Symmetries book has got loads of actual Blake artwork in it and looks amazing. I drew one diagram and some maps. My art isn't quite up to William's, but I'm very glad to be in there.
And I do appreciate that all of his work is in the public domain, and that I get to just freely replicate Swole Newton at the bottom of the ocean as many times as I want.
Yes, my art direction for the game was put a load of Blake work in it, and then Ken Hite got all the Blake work and chose where they would go and put them in the right places. So thank you, Ken.
Let's move on to talking about the book Fearful Symmetries. Fearful Symmetries kind of has three pillars to it. It has the cosmology of William Blake, some ties to the Lovecraft mythos, and UK in the 1930s. And before we continue, like every other Pelgrane book, it's very well written. It shows a clear vision of the game. It has an eye towards the variants on that theme, and it is simply dense. So I guess for the first question for the audience at home, who was William Blake?
So William Blake was born in London in 1757 and he died in London in 1827. And he lived there all his life except for a short, unhappy stay in Sussex for about 3 or 4 years in the early 1800s. He was accused of sedition and assault by a soldier who might have seen him and his wife sunbathing nude in the garden, but he was found not guilty and decided to return to London. His background was he was a fairly well-off working class. His dad was a hosier, so made socks and stockings and things like that, and lived in Soho, which is right in the middle of London. But William demonstrated a natural talent for art, for drawing, when he was a young boy, and his parents were able to afford to send him to art classes. And later on, when he was a teenager, he became apprenticed to an engraver, which sounds like it's on par with other artists, but in the period, engraving was seen as a craft rather than an art. So it was more suitable for the working class and not like painting or drawing, which was a more suitable occupation for a middle and upper class. Blake's apprenticeship went quite well. He found jobs with other people, and then he set out on his own. He initially worked with a friend, but then he worked more on his own because he wanted to produce his own material. And he found a way of having art and text on the same engraved page. So if you look at his poems and his longer works, and his poems in particular, quite often there is poetry and art mixed together on the same page. And he developed this process called relief etching, which it had been used before, but nobody used it to the same extent he did, because most people would have art printed separately from the text, which would be done using the movable type method. Whereas relief etching, you write the text backwards and then you etch out around it and then you print it. So he was never very successful, but he had a number of middle-class patrons, which enabled him to produce the books in which he revealed his own thought. And he also taught his wife to read. She was working class and couldn't even read when they married. He taught her to paint as well, so that she could help with his books. And each one was individually printed and coloured, so that no two Blake original books looked the same. Yeah, so that's his sort of professional life. What we're really after is the sort of mystical life of William Blake. So he was a Christian mystic and a visionary. So he literally saw things, weird things going on in the world around him. When he was a child, he was on Peckham Rye, which is about half a mile from where I'm sitting now, a park, and he saw a tree inhabited by a host of angels, like they were all sort of candles in the tree. And there's a big mural on the side of a pub now which celebrates this. When talking to his friend Varney said, why don't you draw some of these things that you see? And he drew an image called the ghost of a flea, which is a rather terrifying creature which looks a bit like a deep one. It's holding a little bowl where it collects its blood that it drinks from. When his brother died, Blake said that he saw his brother's spirit leave his body and clap in happiness that he was freed from the shackles of this world. He saw the face of God outside his window when he was a child. He saw Milton, and in fact he talked to Milton, the English poet, And he talked to various prophets as well. And at one point, his wife said, I have very little of Mr. Blake's company. He was always in paradise. He was very involved in this imaginary world. And in fact, the imagination was a very key part of his philosophy. He lived at quite a strange time in history. His life coincides with the Industrial Revolution. So a big time of change for the UK with coal and iron and steam. The Newtonian view of the world coming to prominence, machinery and laws were all about how the world worked. It wasn't about spirits and imagination. Blake didn't like that. But also, there were the great revolutions during his lifetime, first in America and then in France, which threw off the shackles of the old regime, and notably for Blake, the old church as well. He didn't like the idea that the way you worship should be imposed on you by the church. And he wanted that freedom to have his own relationship with God. But there were other things going on as well. For the entire period of his life, except for perhaps a short period in 1816, the Kingdom of Great Britain, which it wasn't in 1801, and then the United Kingdom, Britain and Ireland was at war. So the whole time, Britain was fighting somebody else, the Dutch or the French or the Americans. Or the Spanish. There was a lot of worry about spies in England, which is why Blake prosecuted for sedition later in his life, because you just couldn't say bad things about the king. But other things that happened, he was probably the first romantic poet. Later on, we had the late poets, Wordsworth, Tennyson and Coleridge, and a bit later than that, Byron, Shelley and Keats, but they all came after Blake. He rejected the Industrial Revolution and the primacy of science, and he placed the emphasis instead on individual human experience and celebrating the past and nature. So beyond the rules and the laws, there's some sublime aspect to the universe, which is at once awful. You can't contemplate it as a human. It's just beyond your comprehension. But also Blake saw it as uplifting, which is kind of the opposite to Lovecraft, really, I suppose. But also at the same time, Gothic literature started within Blake's lifetime. So The Castle of Otranto, 1764 by Walpole, and Frankenstein was written in 1818, and Poe was born in 1809. All these happened during Blake's lifetime. One of the key aspects of Gothic literature is anxiety. There's always some kind of anxiety at what other people are up to, or what's happening in the world, or just the weather is always threatening you. And anxiety is always present in Blake's work as well, because your imagination, your individuality is always under threat. And then there's some really weird things like Urizen, which is one of the Zoas. In the book of Urizen, his first mention, he creates himself out of the universe. The universe doesn't exist, but he creates himself and he starts as a skull, and then he slowly grows a skeletal body underneath the skull, which emerges into the world. And then this skeletal body is enveloped by blood and flesh, which come from the tears of loss, which is his emanation, a creature that's grown out of his imagination. If you want Gothic horror, you don't have to look far beyond well, it's right there in Blake.
Achieve any sort of fame in his own time, or is this kind of something that only after an intervening century or two that Blake's works and views kind of became popular or well-known?
He had patrons in his time, but he wasn't well known, no. And people who did encounter him just thought he was mad because his views were so contrary to the rest of how people thought the world worked. In the 19th century, he started to be picked up by some poets. So the poet Swinburne championed Blake and brought him to the attention of more people. His papers were owned by the family of one of his patrons, and they became more accessible later on. No, he wasn't really well known in his time at all.
Earlier, a moment ago, you mentioned Urizen as a Zoa. Who are the Zoas?
Before we go into Zoas, I'll talk a bit about Albion.
Sure.
So Albion means white in Latin. It perhaps inspired by the White Cliffs of Dover. It was an early name for England. Geoffrey of Monmouth, who wrote an almost wholly unreliable 12th century history of the kings of England, talks about Albion, inhabited by none but a few giants. And then Brutus of Troy turns up and conquers it and calls it Britannia after himself. And the last giant is called Gog-Magog, and he throws him off a cliff. Gog-Magog dies. Gog-Magog comes back a bit, though, because there are now two giants called Gog and Magog, which are called the protectors of London. They're giants, they protect London, and they're carried each year at the Lord Mayor's show, which sounds like a modern thing, but actually this dates back to the 12th century. So people have been doing this for almost 1,000 years. And then a guy called Holinshead wrote a Chronicles in 1577, which is a bit like Geoffrey of Monmouth stuff, and he mixed up his giants and called the giant Albion. And then Spenser and the Fairy Queen, which is a long poem essentially about Queen Elizabeth I as Queen of the Fairies, also has Albion the giant. So Blake picks up on this, and Albion essentially represents England. He's a giant, he represents England. Some people say he represents all of humanity if you're being generous, but on the whole, Blake, when he's talking about things, is mostly talking about England. He talks about France and the USA a bit as well. And there's a coloured engraving of Albion, which you might have seen. It's on page 17 in Fearful Symmetries, and it's got Albion dancing, having thrown off his shackles. There's also an uncoloured version of the same engraving where a moth is between his feet and flying free from its chrysalis, which represents rebirth. And below is written, Albion rose from where he laboured at the mill with slaves, giving himself for the nations. He danced the dance of death. And so this is England rising above the Industrial Revolution, being reborn and sacrificing himself for the world. And his arms are spread as in crucifixion. And you can see the light of dawn come out behind him. So it's a whole rebirth of a new world where Albion has found himself and has sacrificed himself for the world. Hurrah. Very much the kind of thing England's been doing for, well, no time ever.
So you mentioned Albion as kind of this, is it safe to say embodiment, or is this intended strictly as a metaphor?
It's difficult to say with Blake. One of the things Blake wanted to do, I think, part of his project is to create a mythology for England because it didn't really possess one. And so when he talks about Albion, he does mean it literally, but also it is also metaphorical as well. It's just his writing is so dense and he believed in so many different things that it's difficult to separate the two really with him.
And I don't know if you can answer this, but whenever I hear about a person coming up with a national embodiment about all that is good and right as a country, I immediately wonder, has it been co-opted by fascists? Is there a secret faction that is like William Blake, but also is kind of white supremacist that we need to worry about when we're investigating this?
The only thing I know that is a bit like that is that there is a William Blake Society, and the guy who is in charge of it in the UK is an American. I can't remember his name, but he is a Trump supporter, which is just bizarre. And in fact, it's the one reason I've had nothing to do with the Blake Society because of him. So it's very strange. Given Blake's views on the imagination and freedom, I don't understand it at all. And also sexual freedom. He was very big into sexual freedom for women.
Okay, so there has not yet been the movement that has successfully co-opted this in some way where it's like, we can't read that anymore.
No,
that's good.
I don't think so. In one view of Albion, in one of his books, in the epic poem Jerusalem, Albion essentially is asleep. And while Albion is sleeping, the four parts of Albion, the Zoas, run around and do stuff. And the main four parts of Albion are Tharmas, which is it's instinct and strength, but without compassion. So it's God, it represents the whole body. He's a bit like a shepherd who looks after his flock. And then there's Urizen, who is the head. He represents reason and tradition, but no imagination. So he's the one who sets the laws about how things should work. And he's pretty savage generally, because that's how it's always done. And then you've got Luva, who's heart and passion and Jesus, and has all the emotions joined together under love. The final one is Urthona, who's inspiration and imagination. Urthona is also sometimes called Los, who's a blacksmith who uses his hammer to create things and to change things as well. So these are the main four emanations that come out of Albion in the epic poem Jerusalem. It's the story of Albion has fallen. These things are now separated. It's the attempt by Los mainly to try and put the whole thing back together again. So imagination being the inspiration to save the world, put Albion back together so that it works again. But then you get other emanations that come out of Albion. Further down, you get Los and Orc. So Orc is Los's son, who is born, depending on which book you read, in the Book of Urizen, it's slightly different. Book of Jerusalem. He's the son of Los and Enitharmon, and he is one of the bad guys, I suppose. Although everybody has bad 5 minutes in this, at least. I mean, Los tries to build things properly, but it doesn't always go right. So far, these are all male emanations from Albion, and you get the female emanations, which separate from the Zoa. And the explanation is that Eve was separated from Adam, and these are the same. So you get all the different aspects of women. So there's Enyon, who's separated from Tharmas, so she's the Earth Mother, who controls the fertility or not of the earth. And, Shub-Niggurath, maybe we're thinking there. There's Celestial Ahanya, who represents pleasure. There are two kinds of pleasure. There's pleasure when you glory in it and enjoy it, and there's debased pleasure, which is jealous or secretive, and sin is some kind of sinful pleasure. There's Vala, who's an emanation from Luva, who is nature, and she tends animals, but also can show the carnivorous, vicious side of nature as well. Nature can kill you as well as nurture you. And finally, there's Enitharmon, who is out of loss and is the musical side of loss and represents the homemaker or the nurse. If she's misguided, she can become reactionary and do the opposite to those things. So it's all quite complicated, and Blake doesn't stop there either. He goes, there are several more of these things that he creates, which are either emanations from loss or couplings of other of the emanations. You can keep going down further and further and adding these in. And in fact, I use most of them in the game because they've all got some aspect that might be interesting for a player. In the same way in Fearful Symmetry, in Gumshoe generally, your character has a drive. The way these are used in the game means that there's some aspect of these emanations, of these Zoas that you want to incorporate into your character.
Yeah, you have the 12 sons of Albion, you have the 12 daughters as well, that are referred to with various degrees of consistency throughout the text. In trying to do some homework on this, I was looking up information on Urizen, who Ancient of Days is an absolutely baller piece of art. And anytime you get to slap that on the table, I consider that to improve things. And it was a Reddit thread where someone got a Ancient of Days tattoo. And the first post was a well actually of someone going, in the epic poem Jerusalem, Urizen is the bad guy. And I'm like, that's amazing. The first reply to someone getting a William Blake tattoo is the well actually of you got the bad guy. And it quickly descended into an argument about Nazis. So I'm like, okay, it's good to know that some things never change. Having worked on this, is it one of those things where like the names of the Zoas and what they're associated with are now in your bones? Or do you still have to periodically be like, oh, what was Enitharmon in charge of? What was her nature?
Yeah, no, I have to go back and look. The ones that I know more about, the ones that the players in my group are using, I'm more frequently reminded about those. But I have some NPCs that are associated with them as well, so they come in. It's a lot to keep track of if you want all of them.
And you make mention of your players. Page 3 are acknowledgements, which includes playtesters. And the groups are Thelemic Order of Silver Twilight, Esoteric Order of Albion, Order of the Crimson Dragon, Council of the Lion Rampant, Cupertories Mysterii, the Aegis of Oxford, and then Group 4 and 5. And my heart goes out to Group 4 and 5. But regardless, it's always good to see a role-playing game text that has a playtest section, because I've certainly played a lot that clearly did not.
But 2 of them are currently still playing.
Neat.
It's a good sign.
Yeah. You make mention to potential ties with the Lovecraft mythos. What are some angles we can take in connecting the Lovecraft mythos, or more accurately, the Blake cosmology, kind of with the Lovecraft mythos?
I went through William Blake and H.P. Lovecraft, and I looked for themes. I didn't necessarily just read all of Blake's work, because some of it's quite deep and impenetrable.
Because we wouldn't have the book yet if you had to.
You wouldn't. I mean, it took me 8 years anyway. Using a lot of material that other people produced about Blake as well, I looked at some of the key themes for it, particularly the ones that I thought would link well to Lovecraft. The first one is the fall of man. Albion falling asleep and these things breaking up is essentially similar to the fall of man. So Albion does not live within harmony with himself. You're on a voyage, or Albion and his parts are on a voyage of rediscovery of self and trying to build themselves back together again. And essentially, Lovecraft, there's a fall as well that man is not aware of. You're always contained, some mythos root in the background means that you are squamous or just horrible or related to deep ones, something that you don't want to accept and that you deny, but ultimately the truth will out. I mean, it's happier for Blake because this voyage of rediscovery leads to you getting back whole and becoming whole again. And I suppose in the Call of Cthulhu, the hero does become whole again when he accepts the unholy truth of his birth and returns to the sea. That might be viewed as happy by some people.
With the mythos, it seems to be things start out bad and are then concealed and are then revealed. Whereas with Blake, no, there is this, we would kind of recognize that initial state of being great or idyllic. Now, with the Blake angle, is that the angle for humanity, or is that just an individual person? Like, is this a personal quest for unity, or is this something that we as a society should be striving for?
Yes, for Blake, it's very much for a society. When he talks about Albion, Albion represents England. It's the whole of England that needs to do this, become more aware. But if you read the Book of Urizen about where the world comes from, it's essentially Urizen, who's a vindictive and horrible god, who gets bored and makes the world and then summons people into it. And we're getting somewhere into Ligotti territory here, because it's suggesting that it was always bad, and the best you can hope for is to go back to nothingness.
Real demiurge energy there.
Yeah, some people have suggested that Blake is a Gnostic, so has a demiurge as the creator. It's less clear whether that's actually the case. I think he does believe in the power of Jesus to save mankind, I think, because Jesus turns up and does those kinds of things. So it would be untrue to pin that on Blake, but it's certainly a reading you can make of it.
And it's kind of interesting because at the time, like, just the notion of Gnosticism hadn't really reemerged yet.
Yeah.
We have this multi-century gap between, like, the Albigensians being crushed and kind of its reemergence in the early 1900s. Now, thought strains and so on were obviously around and out, but a lot of the Justinian and Valentinian texts were just kind of lost for some period of time. I also have a subtle theory that when people mean Gnostic, they really are just talking about Philip K. Dick, but that's neither here nor there. So are there any other themes that you felt connected the works of Blake and maybe the works of Lovecraft?
Well, another one is science is despair is a strong one. The very beginning of the Call of Cthulhu, Lovecraft says the sciences have hitherto harmed us little, but someday the piercing together of dissociated knowledge will open up such terrifying vistas of reality in our frightful positions therein. We shall either go mad from the revelation or flee from the deadly light into the peace and safety of a new dark age. And Blake thinks science is evil as well, not because it is looking for new things, but because it's restricting what you can think about, because it's placing everything within order and it's denying imagination. So kind of the opposite reason for Lovecraft again. Lovecraft thinks it's going to reveal terrible things or things man should not know. Blake thinks it's not going to give us the freedom to explore where we should or what we can and make the most of ourselves from being free.
That science gives us this false sense of explaining the totality of experience when really what it is just doing is highly categorizing and defining a narrow band of the human experience. There's a kind of the C.P. Snow view of things that science needs to be expanded to meet with arts and culture at some point, or it is a societal function will kind of fail. Your opening Lovecraft quote reminded me of the most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents and kind of the degree to which science allows us to expand that. Now, was Blake a primitivist in any way? Did he throw off the shackles of progress? Was he personally opposed to it? Was this a Walden thing, or was it kind of just a view of the scientific mind frame and not necessarily just progress itself?
I don't think he was opposed to progress as such, but he was opposed to law, telling people what to do. So he liked spirituality, but he had big problems with the church and the way religion was organized and the way you were told to go to church. And he had a big problem with the way law was about marriage. He thought that if you loved somebody, there should be no legal opposition to you having sex. He never discussed homosexuality, as far as I know, and he upset his wife several times by suggesting that when she wasn't interested in sex, he could have sex with somebody else. There's no record that he ever did, but also we know that a number of his pieces of art were destroyed after he died because they were possibly too sexually suggestive for the period. And some of his pieces of art had fig leaves put on them by people who were worried about upsetting the servants. It's not very clear whether he's against progress as such, but the Industrial Revolution is chewing up England. I mean, the Romantic poets are very much against, heaps of coal and blackened earth. And Blake talks about the dark satanic mills, which could be factories, could also be churches. They both fall under that sort of rubric for him. But he was very keen on America, though, and he saw America as being progressive, taking things in new directions and making man more free.
Yeah, during his lifetime, that makes sense. That was the American Revolution, and that sparked the better part of 50, 60 years of revolutions in Europe.
Yeah, Blake was friends with Thomas Paine, although they didn't see each other very often.
Having gone through this sheer volume of work, do you have a favorite Blake piece at this point, either artistically or literarily?
I'm a big fan of The Night of Enitharmon's Joy, which is a very spooky painting. It's just amazingly gothic. There's a bat in the night, there's an owl, there's a snake, there's a donkey eating a thistle. There's Hecate, who's the triple goddess, who has a book open in front of her. I'm imagining it's a book of magic. It's reminiscent of Fuseli as well, who I don't know if you've seen his painting of the sort of frog-like demon sitting on a woman's chest representing nightmare.
Is there an ancient association in the Gothic with the donkey? Is there just an angle of horror I have been missing, like the harsh donkeys of the night?
I don't know what the donkey comes from. It could be a scene from Macbeth, and it's just the three witches there, and they got their donkey sitting there next to them. I mean, the owl usually represents wisdom. Snakes represent, poison and witchcraft and evil.
And Hecate represents people just out having a good time. So I always like that as a
Well, Hecate is the queen of magic. In fact, she's very important to witches nowadays. There's a big resurgence in Wicca in investigating Hecate and her rites.
Hecate, she's so hot right now.
She is. And as the goddess of the moon, she became very important in my campaign.
So while we're on the subject, what is the nature of magic in this game, and how does it differ from standard Trail or Call of Cthulhu magic that listeners may be familiar with?
So in standard Trail of Cthulhu, the magic is very much the same magic that you saw in Call of Cthulhu. It's spells that people have learnt mostly from mythos entities, a lot of them about summoning, controlling mythos entities, or doing really horrible things, such as shattering somebody and eating their face.
Yeah, standard magical effects, yeah.
Whereas the magic in this game is much more inspired by classical magic from, antiquity, Middle Ages, and from the magical groups that existed following the occult revival of the 1880s in England and Europe and America, essentially, as well. And so come up with 4 different kinds of magic for the game. There is alchemy, which is control over elements. It can be done with test tubes in a laboratory, but also I take a wider view of how you might access the elements. And as you become more proficient, you don't need to do it in a laboratory anymore. There is magic with a K, which is inspired by Thelema, the magic of Aleister Crowley and John Dee, and it involves quite a mystical voyage of self-discovery, looking at the ethers, which were mystical realms that John Dee decided existed in his Talking with Angels in Enochian.
Aethyrs, I think, or
yeah.
Mage fans may know that is part of the full title of Dewizitep, Realm Master of the Aether. So if you're looking for that, realize it's spelled differently. And there is a fantastic write-up in the book that goes through the, 26 or 32 of them,
30.
and what they may contain and what they look like, and possibly why you are there and why you are passing through them. So,
and you can go to Crowley and read this stuff online as well. I've summarized some of Crowley's experiences in these, but in Liber 412, is it? I can't remember. He writes about what happened when he visited them. I mean, some kind of astral projection into them. I also have spiritualism. So spiritualism was very popular in England and America. It started in America with the Fox sisters in the Burned Over district in New York, table tapping and communicating with spirits. And then it came to England. Arthur Conan Doyle was a big fan, particularly after the First World War. So many young people died that spiritualism got a big boost from that, and it's still going strong in the 1930s, although it's lost a lot of its trappings of classism that happened in the UK, where the mediums were all young, pretty working class girls, and the people going to the seances were all rich, upper class people. It's shed a lot of that by this period. In fact, there's still a spiritualist church not very far from where Dee saw his vision on Peckham Rye, so also half a mile from where I live, and people still practice this. And the last one is witchcraft, which is essentially the magic of nature. And you might meet a group of witches quite early on in the game who worship at the Rollright Stones, which is an old ring of stones in Oxfordshire, and they are big into crows.
So these are different from Lovecraft's witch cult?
Well, they could be a witch cult in the signing the Black Book way you get in Lovecraft and Dreams in the Witch House. They could be that kind of thing if you want them to be. So every NPC in the book has been written up in 3 different ways, whether they're a positive for the group or negative, or twisted is the last one, which is they have something weird and Lovecraftian going on. So you could run them as friendly, or you could run them as having signed the Black Book and be Nyarlathotep worshippers if you want.
And it seems like there's an interpretation of mythos magic that is actually just kind of a hyperscience, hypergeometry thing that your mind is opened up to, and this is kind of a latent aspect of the universe that it could be viewed as highly scientific. These styles of magic are kind of independent of that. and they each seem to have a dominion and kind of a thing that they excel at. For these, do you feel that it is best if a group kind of picks one and everyone is a practitioner of that, or is this a mix and match thing in actual play?
In actual play, almost every group has gone with magic, and as all the practitioners do the same kind of magic. They encounter NPCs who do the other kinds of magic. They have relationships with them. I think the first spiritualist my own group met was the aunt of one of the play characters. She decided her aunt was a spiritualist because they needed to know whether somebody was alive or dead. There is some kind of, I suppose, niche protection to a certain extent between the groups of magic. There are some things, if you want to talk to dead people, you're not going to get a magician to do it. You're going to get a spiritualist. If you want to control nature, you're going to talk to a witch. If you want to project forces and travel to weird regions of space and time, it's magic. If you want to make physical things, then it's an alchemist generally. The effects can be similar, but the source of them, or the reason how they work, is slightly different. But also the other thing, which is stated up front in the book, is the reason why this magic is here is because in 1925 the Call of Cthulhu went out and reawakened everybody who had any magical ability, and reawakened the power of magic in the land, in particular in England.
When you say that, are you saying that all of them draw from Cthulhu, or that the waking of Cthulhu just kind of reactivated other extant magical things? I guess my question is alchemy a thing unto itself, or is alchemy just a weird distortion of the magic of the old ones?
Yes.
Okay.
You can run it both ways. I think in my game it might be a weird. I think everything is essentially ultimately Lovecraftian. It is quite distantly Lovecraftian, and the players might never encounter that. I'm surprised my players haven't realised that yet.
And one of the things that the text does, though, is it doesn't tell you. It does something that I like when game books do and say, we do not have a canonical answer, but here are 3 choices that you can make. If you want this to be an independent thing, if you want Albion to just be a veneer on top of Yog-Sothoth, that's entirely fine. If you would like him to be another kind of great old one or something like that opposed to it, if you want that to be the embodiment of human prowess or something like that, that's okay too. The important part is you say, here are options, rather than just leaving it vague and never telling us. So
I think I take my cue from Blake there, which is free the imagination.
Mm-hmm.
And you can free the imagination by saying do what you want, which is great, but then there are so many choices you don't know. So give some examples, help people build things. It doesn't seem to be much point in writing a book and then saying do what you want. You bought the book because you want to know what to do, so give you some options. I mean, you might do something completely differently, which is great. There is no canon. Do what you want with it.
And another thing about the magic in this book is, when I think of Call of Cthulhu or Trail of Cthulhu magic, frequently every effect I do that isn't utterly trivial costs my character in some way. Is magic different here? Is it intended to be a little bit more freewheeling? Is it something I can do without ultimately shattering my sanity after 3 sessions?
It is. So when you're setting up the game at the start, there's a discussion to be had with the players about what kind of magical group they're going to have. Essentially, they're in a magical group at the start of the game. And one of the discussions there is how much magic you want in it, and how dangerous is magic as well. So Trail of Cthulhu has 2 sanity monitors. It has stability, which is your kind of willpower and how you're getting on a day-to-day basis, and sanity, which can go up and go down, but in my games it only ever goes down. Essentially represents how capable you are of being in a world full of humans, as opposed to not understanding why they're not completely afraid of Cthulhu all the time. Or, you're off in the dreamlands and you're no longer part of humanity, really. And stability is what powers magic for the most point. And also there's a new stat in here called magic, which also powers magic, which means you don't have to rely on stability as much. And in fact, there's a whole load of information about how to create spells, how to bring in the magical thinking of the time. So there's a lot of things about the laws of magic. And there are so many different ways in which magic can work. There's the law of contagion. If a person's touched this thing, you can affect the person because they've touched that thing. So by contagion, you can jump onto them because those things are related. But there's the law of opposites. It's made of fire and you've got a water thing, so it'll affect it because it's the opposite. There's the law of attraction. It's the same as the other thing. So you're in a car and they're in a car, so you can make their car stop by casting a spell. And there's any number of these things. And then there's the sort of correspondences between day of the week Are we Sunday? It's good for doing sun rituals, and it's good for doing things that affect light, and it's good for doing things that are about God as well, if you're interested in that kind of thing. So let's do that on a Sunday. Thursday is Thor's day. If you're doing any lightning magic, maybe that's a good day to do it. But there are also correspondences between flowers and all sorts of things. And essentially, the book just gives you a whole load of these reasons, a whole load of ways in which you might interpret this and how you might build magical effects by bringing these correspondences. And mechanically, they just make it easier for you to cast a spell. So it's in your interest as a player to read some of this stuff and try and bring it into your magic, rather than just say, I'm casting, summon Yog-Sothoth.
You mention these correspondences and you specifically say, hey, for effects of this size, you need so and many of these to make it feasibly doable. You even have an extra page where you talk about geometria and sigil magic and electric magic, which I think needs to make a comeback in terms of wild claims made about how the natural world works. In my after talk with Bryce, we're going to go into some of those in a few more details and talk about how we can steal those for Mage the Ascension. You also present the idea of how to create a magic group in terms of creating your little band of characters and so on. What does that kind of look like? Like, what do you consider to be those basic choices?
So at the start of the campaign, there are two kinds of things we go through. There's the ground rules, which are metagaming stuff, which most games will go through. Now you'll have a session 0 where you'll talk about how this game is going to be run. Pretty much everybody is doing that now for safe and happy gaming. But then for magical groups, there are different things you go through. So there's the style of magic, which is one of the 4: alchemy, spiritualism, magic, and witchcraft. I say you could do multiple styles. The default style is magic, and most people seem to go with that. Then I go with some rules which set up how the group is going to operate in the world, and also how other groups are going to operate. The first one of these is called the Winchester Covenant. And so this is essentially setting who is it acceptable to do magic on. And the idea is that all magical groups will have signed up to this to some extent. And it can go through, you shouldn't use magic to hurt anyone, is sort of the top. The most stringent and the least stringent is you shouldn't destroy the world with magic.
Pretty restrictive to me. I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, particularly in the light of what Lovecraftian cults get up to. Then there's the Chatham House rule, which is a rule from politics. In politics, it means if you have a meeting subject to the Chatham House rule, you can talk about what happened, but you can't attribute anything at the meeting to anyone in the meeting. So you can know what was discussed and what the outcome of that was, but you can't attribute any quote to any one person. Here it's taken a bit more widely, and the default setting is that do not investigate outsiders from magic in magic, because it will break them. In my experience, most groups go with that as well, although they go with it at the start, but then it becomes more fluid later on as they get involved in dodgy business.
The laws of magic kind of turn out to be the rough guideline of magic. Yeah, understood.
Yeah, well, most of them have actually killed a lot of people.
That also seems to tie with a lot of RPG experience I have.
Yeah. That's not surprising, sadly.
Most of the people they've killed were evil worshippers of some Lovecraftian deity, but not all of them. Not everybody who was an evil worshipper of Lovecraftian deity knew that they were. Then you have group details. So a name, think of a lovely name for your group, and you mentioned a number of them. All my playtest groups had lovely names, but then choose a goal for your group. Or in Trail of Cthulhu, at least, each character has a drive, and this is the reason why your character carries on exploring and investigating these fearful mysteries where normal people would either say, right, I've had enough, or phone the police. No, you want knowledge or power, or my favorite one is it's in the blood, where your character has some kind of Lovecraftian thing going on in their family, and the player doesn't necessarily know what it is. They just say, I want to choose that as my drive. That's why I'm exploring things. We'll find out in play what it means. And for a long campaign, that's great. It took 190 sessions to resolve it in my current group.
How do you even start to keep that many sessions straight anyway?
There you go. Really good notes.
I have Notepad++. You can have text files, and I start a new text file for each session. And I have them all open at once, and I can search all of them. And because my game is to a large extent improvised, I don't decide what's going to happen in a session before the session to any great extent. So I need to know what has happened. I put notes for future sessions about what I think might be happening next, but this is an amazing resource for finding out what's going to happen or what has happened.
Having 270 text files opened at the same time from a person who talks about the terror of opening yourself up to the cosmos really seems to fit. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, you have a fair point.
Yeah, each time you open all of those, point of stability just gone.
Well, I never shut them. They're always open. Mind you, I have 40 windows on my browser at the moment as well, so I'm
I
bad
have
person.
3, and I feel like that's too many.
Exactly. I have 2 things open right now, and I'm barely holding it together.
The goal of your group can be knowledge, power, or a magnum opus, which is, make a grand magical marvel of some kind. Then they have to choose a holy day, which is the day that is holy to your group. You might get some more magic points on that day from a generous GM, and there'll be a celebration of some kind. And then you have the inner sanctum of your group. The default one is the Radcliffe camera, which a number of groups have chosen. So the Radcliffe camera just means a circular room. It's a theatre in Oxford, in the middle of the university. It's an amazing building standing on its own next to the Bodleian Library, which is also an amazing library for magicians. So also next to that, there's a science museum which has got one of John Dee's tables of correspondences in it. So it seems like a good place to be for a magician. And also there's a pub opposite that sells good pies.
It's everything you need. It's one-stop shopping.
And there's a membership policy as well. How do people join your group? Is nobody ever allowed to join your group? Does somebody need to die for somebody to join? And the reason I put this in is because it's not unusual for characters to die in Lovecraftian games. And so how welcoming are you going to be to a new person? Can you cultivate new people before somebody leaves the group? Do you let NPCs join as well? That kind of thing.
In addition to these group mechanics, which are perfectly reasonable ways to kind of set up a group, you also introduce 2 other pretty interesting technologies to create background to the game, the Folklore Engine and the History Machine. Do you have a favorite one of these, and just kind of what is it?
Well, the Folklore Engine, because my style of gaming is essentially improvisational, and I think Gumshoe is quite well suited to this, although it wasn't necessarily set up in that way. But Robin Laws wrote the Armitage Files, and I wrote a piece in that about improvised gaming. So essentially, core clues, which is the motor that drives Gumshoe. You just need to give players core clues so that they have between 2 and 5 things to investigate at any one time. And then when they go and investigate a clue, you can decide how it fits into the bigger picture. And I have some other rules like reincorporation. It's a bit like a joke. A joke sets up the punchline by talking about something earlier on and then coming back to it in a way you didn't quite expect at the end. Writing Trail of Cthulhu improvised scenarios is the same. Talk about something going on and then come back to it in a way that the players didn't quite expect. Or listen to what the players are saying and come back to it in the way they said it's happened. Generally, I mix those 2 things up. So sometimes I've decided which way it's going a long time beforehand. Sometimes they're investigating something and I put some clues in there, like they found these little claws in they raided a shop which belonged to a deep one who was living in the middle of England a long way from the sea for reasons. And they found some things in the basement of a shop, these small claws, because I wanted something interesting. I didn't know where it was going. And then, 20 sessions later, they found out what these claws were and what they could do with them. Initially, they thought they were shark's teeth because there are beaches in England where you find prehistoric shark's teeth, not very far from where I lived on the East Coast. So the Folklore Engine is a way for me to create folklore on the fly in a game. That's how it came up, essentially. My wife is a proper folklorist, and we were both members of the Folklore Society. She essentially knows pretty much every single ghost in England somehow. We were on the train coming back from Liverpool the other day, not just ghost, but folklore. I mean, she wrote the Book of the Smoke and the Book of the New Jerusalem, which were associated with this. She knew most of that stuff beforehand, which was just scary. So I read about folkloristics, which is the sort of science of folklore. I looked at the way folklore is structured because there was a lot of structuralists who talked about folklore and fairy stories. And Joseph Campbell, So Joseph Campbell, who I don't like at all because he imposes far too much structure on things. So I wanted a more loosey-goosey way of building a folklore event. And so it has a location, it happened somewhere. There were some people there. There were some strange things there because it's folklore, and folklore is all about weirdness. An event happened. And because of this event, there was an outcome that happened to the people who were there. And now there's a trace of this in the folklore. So people in the oral history, people talk about it, or there's a mention of it in a book or something. And this is essentially what folklore is. It's the stories we tell about ourselves. And this is just a quick way of, it's just a list for each of these things. There's, between 10 or 12 what supernatural actors were involved in this event. Dragons, fairies, hybrids, strange combinations of things that should not be, such as plasma and gas and animal. Religious saints and devils are very popular in England. It could be wild animals or the wild hunt, which chases people around on horseback until they die or are assumed into wild hunt and have to sit on a horse for eternity. And so I've used this in my game. And in fact, I've gone even further. I've written a perchance generator that now I can just click a button. There's a website and it just generates folklore stuff for me. Kind of where the other thing I created comes in the history machine. Essentially, the history machine is Ken Hite. I did think about it calling the Height Machine, but essentially with Ken Height, I don't know if everybody follows his podcast with Robin Laws, but you should. And they do a thing called nerd troping, where they take a nerd thing and a real world thing and a historical thing, and they put them together. And then Ken talks about it for half an hour and about how you can build a game on this, how you can build 4 games on this. And it's just amazing. My history and my nerd stuff is quite good, but I can't do that. And so the history machine is essentially use the real world and combine things in ways that people didn't expect or twist them. And so it talks about how to do that. I talk about the way I wrote the game, in fact, was that my players were investigating a ley line in Cambridge, which is where Sir Isaac Newton worked for most of his life. And I checked up on him in Wikipedia and found that his half-niece inherited his papers, and she left them to a daughter who married Viscount Portmore. And in the 1930s, he was an American, born in Chicago, served with the British Army, and then started a far-right group in England called England Proud. I've changed the names, but these are real people. And their philosophy was mainly expounded by a guy called Albert Martini. And I read some of his stuff, which is it's kind of like Trump, but written in the 1930s. More intellectual than Trump, but the same kind of messages.
That is a low hurdle to clear.
And so he sounded like a good bad guy. So they weren't investigating this guy at the time, but it sounded like he should be behind things. And so I thought a bit about Martini, who'd read the Newton papers. Newton studied them and he created this device which allows you to find ley lines. In fact, I did a handout which talks about the device. I just kept building on this Martini guy and this Portmore guy, and I decided he'd found ley lines. He didn't really understand what they were, but he got into magic, found a magic book. Oh dear, it was the Unausprechlichen Kulten. He read that and went mad. Not in the way that real people do. He went mad in as much as his brain was scrambled to the extent that he became devoted to a mythos deity of some kind.
I think we all go through that phase in our teenage years.
Yeah.
The crux of the history machine is pretty fascinating, especially for any sort of game that is going to be conspiratorial or has space for the conspiratorial, which basically says, take a real world event. Who could have benefited from it? What is a sinister spin we can put on it? What is a cynical take or a morally ambiguous take that we can put on it? What is a coincidence that seems too coincidental for our liking? Who will profit from this? And then how do we bring that into something that the players are able to engage with? Another piece of advice you have is look for links, however tenuous, between the real and the fantastic, which I think for any game that involves kind of magic or the mythical, that is valid, as well as kind of an emphasis on having multiple angles of possible truth, that you have kind of layers of interpretation on top of each other. And again, this doesn't need to just apply to this game, and this is part of the reason why it's kind of so fascinating to talk about it. It's just kind of a way to keep generating bits, as well as another piece of your advice: sheer madness. If it looks too good to be true and yet it's utterly insane, use it. So I think we've also all been there as storytellers.
You explain it so much better than I do. Thank you.
Here to help.
Yeah, the history machine is going to be a fantastic tool for anybody who's running any kind of conspiratorial setting or themed game. Kudos. Yeah, and fantastic.
Thank you. And as part of it, I suggest also drawing relationship maps so you can have a visual idea of how these things stack up and where the links are, because they're quite easy to get a grasp on quickly. I find players draw them as well.
Now, you say draw a map, but I think what you really mean is to get a board with some push pins and some red string.
Well, yes. I would love that, but we play online, so it's a bit harder to do that.
That's the next virtual tabletop add-in. Someone needs to figure out the corkboard string conspiracy board. The greatest conspiratorial map in all of World of Darkness is still going to be Bob Schnoblin's Pyramid of Satanic Power. So anytime we can include that into a game where the Girl Scouts, the Sierra Club, and the Brotherhood of the Youthanatoi are all connected, I'm here for it, certainly. So those are kind of some of the underlying technologies. There are a bunch that are in here, and again, they go far beyond the four corners of just fearful symmetry. Jumping to the 30s and kind of our last cluster of sections, why the 1930s? And what, if any, were some of the interesting ideas that were just kind of in the air at the time that we as people almost a century later wouldn't consider?
Yeah, the 1930s was a period of, essentially it was the 1930s because Chaosium had done the 1920s, so we chose the 1930s because it was next, and we wanted a similar kind of vibe. The 1930s is much like Blake's time as a period of upheaval. This is another period of massive upheaval in the United Kingdom because our empire was falling away. The United States was now the top industrial country in the world, had been actually for 20 years by the 1930s. India was drifting away from us. Gandhi was taking it away. We still owe America $4.4 billion for World War One. In fact, we have never paid that off. Don't tell anyone. Paid our Second World War debt, not our First World War debt. There was massive societal upheaval because of the Depression. And in England in particular, the North, which was more industrialised than the South had a lot more of the service industries. The North was far more affected in the UK. And there was a big hunger march from Jarrow to London, which is the length of England almost. And on top of this, the weirdness of spiritualism, because of everybody who died in the First World War. There are some villages, all the young men of the village died. And it's difficult to think about walking around your small town and just not seeing any man under 30 or under 45, quite possibly. There was just nobody to do the work, as it was thought of at that time. The state of women had changed recently as well, because they'd got universal suffrage in the UK in 1921. But also there are a lot of these occult groups around. So there'd been in a big occult revival in the 1890s in the UK with the Golden Dawn was the first big one of these really, which brought magical thinking back. It was quite closely aligned with Masonic ritual. It was also quite a lot of it was based on Egyptian stuff, which was very popular at the time as well. But then you had things like Madame Blavatsky and her writing and Theosophy, which touches quite a lot on Lovecraft, because she talks about all these precursor races that existed before humanity. And I think Lovecraft mentions her by name in some. But then there were other societies which just got even stranger. So the Panacea Society, which is a favourite in this household. So Joanna Southcott was a seer and visionary who died in 1814. She lived in Devon. So actually she was contemporary with Blake. She lived from 1750 to 1814. And she was convinced that she was going to give birth to the new Messiah, which she didn't.
That we know of.
Well, yes. She had this box. She'd put all her stuff in, which was kept by an enclave of her followers who all moved to the town of Bedford, which is, about 35 miles north of London. The box was going to be opened when all the bishops got together and opened it. Actually, it was opened in 1927 by Harry Price, who was a psychic researcher in the UK, who claimed to have come possession of it and opened it with the Bishop of Grantham. And there were some unimportant papers, a horse pistol and a lottery ticket in there. Now, the Southcottians, the Panacea Society, said that wasn't the proper box, and they ran a campaign on billboards to try and get the bishops together to open the box. You needed 24 bishops. They claimed that war, disease, crime and banditry, distress of nations and perplexity will increase until the bishops open Joanna Southcott's box. And they also said the world would end in 2004.
Passed me right by. I was working that day.
The last member of their order died in 2012, but there is still a charitable organisation that carries on the work, or at least has a museum dedicated to Southcott. So they're quite an unusual and exciting group to include in your game. What do they have in that box?
I just like the fact that it included a horse pistol, which from what I understand of British stereotypes represented 4% of all firearms in the United Kingdom. So it was pretty important to have that in the box.
I mean, it's the lottery ticket that gets me. I mean, surely if you're going to give birth to the new Messiah, you got the winning numbers, right?
You would hope so. I mean, yeah, somebody should have kept that ticket because it was bound to come up. So the other thing that was happening in the 30s in most of Europe was the rise of fascism. Pretty much every country in Europe had a fascist group that was more or less successful. Italy, Germany, Portugal, Spain all had fascist governments that some of them outlasted the war, in fact, Portugal until the 1970s. The rise of fascism, the relationship with Germany, and also the rise of witchcraft happened at the same time. And there was a group called the New Forest Coven, and they engaged in the magical Battle of Britain.
I've heard of these.
Yeah, so Hitler or some of his mates were quite strongly into the occult, like Hess and Himmler. A lot of occult groups got banned in Germany as the Nazi party rose in power, because they weren't, partly because a lot of people thought their magic was too Jewish, and partly because they were threatening the party line. The Nazis carried on with the Arne Neighbor, which was their archaeological group that kept investigating and looking for magic items like the Spear of Longinus, or searching for the Holy Grail in the Pyrenees for some reason. And so the New Forest Coven was set up as a counter. This is what they said later on. They set up as a counter to try and do a magical spell to prevent the Nazis from invading Britain. And they built a pyramid of power in the New Forest, it's called the New Forest because it was planted in about the 13th century. It was
relatively new.
Yeah, well, it was new back then. We've got rid of most of our old forests, but the New Forest was a hunting ground for the king, and so remains until this day and still has wild horses in it. It's on the south coast, and this is where they built their pyramid of power, which countered the Nazis and stopped them from invading the United Kingdom. So Project Sea Lion failed because of this pyramid of power.
Can't argue with results. So, I mean, yeah, strong work.
And I suppose the other thing around the time is the work of Alfred Watkin. So Alfred Watkin was a historian and a man with some spare time. He wandered around a place where he lived, which was Herefordshire on the Welsh borders, and he noticed that a lot of the standing stones and the barrows that were left over from Neolithic and Anglo-Saxon times were aligned. And his idea was that people had placed them on the hilltops so that you could have a point to aim at, because you didn't have a compass and you didn't have any maps. So how would you know which way to get home? You'd look on the hills, you'd look at the hills around you, and that one's got a standing stone. So we'll aim for that standing stone and we'll build another one on the hill beyond that. And these all line up. It was actually a German who came up with this idea slightly before Watkins, but he didn't get very far with it. So Watkins published a book called The Old Straight Track, which is essentially saying Neanderthals built these things on hilltops so that they could get around the country. This was co-opted by people with slightly more magical thinking, saying, well, these lines across the country, they must be lines of power in some way. And so the idea is that these lines are, in my conceit anyway, these lines are left over from some mythos past. They've been reactivated by the call of Cthulhu, which has sent this wave across the world, and now they can provide magic to magical practitioners in England. I'm not saying there aren't ley lines or other ways of getting magic in other parts of the world, but this is what's happening in England, and this is why there's a proliferation of magical groups, because they have this power, a source that they can tap into using rituals. And in fact, ley lines turn up in so many games, really. There's a lot of different games who talk about them being a source of power, I think.
I do kind of like the idea that ley lines are this example of, for lack of a better term, magical induction, that in the same way that a coronal mass ejection can induce current in power lines, that the waking of a great old one suddenly reactivates these things, and suddenly Skellig Michael bursts into flames or something like that, and you're like, besides the destruction of a lot of great historical sites, having magic back is pretty cool, but just a lot of monasteries that go down. Take that, St. Michael's line. And I assume you were talking about Wilhelm Tudit. He was the...
Oh, yes. He's actually turned up in my game as an NPC, and I couldn't remember his name.
Yeah, he picked the wrong pony in the 20s, so I'm fine ignoring him.
Toit. I think he's called Toit. Tudt. He was a member of the Arna Neighbor as well.
Yeah, which, if you look up on Wikipedia, is listed as a Schutzstaffel think tank. And I'm like, that's one way of describing it.
They were an offshoot of the SS, yes.
Yeah. So you tapped on a few of the mystical societies that are popular in the 1930s. And speaking of the history engine, there is no reason to think that these are not in some way still around. Even failed millennial or eschatological cults have a way of sticking around well past the time that their predictions have proven to be completely wrong. You mentioned the Argentum Astrum, the Church of the Universal Bond, the Fraternity of the Inner Light, the Liberal Catholic Church, which is the most terrifying of all as someone who is raised as a Catholic. That L word in there is just mystifying to me. The Cult of the Morning Star, Theosophy, writ large. There is this is rich with options if you would like mortal magical groups, or especially in a game like Mage, you're looking for something that your character is secretly in charge of or in contact with. My last question is there anything else that you've worked on recently or are working on that you feel would be useful in any kind of urban fantasy game, or is there a next project that we should keep our eyes out for?
So it took me 8 years to write Fearful Symmetries. And in fact, towards the end, I just handed it over to Ken Hite, and he did all the pictures and created the magic system. And the reason for that is I suffer from chronic fatigue. And so it became very difficult to write. So my output has massively slowed down. I did contribute some folklore stuff to a 5e game called A Folklore Bestiary by the Merry Mush Men, which is a French group of publishers. It's written in English, though. So the conceit here was to take creatures from your culture and turn them into a fantasy game. Now, I've used these in Vaesen, which is the Fria-Ligan game of 1890s or Victorian, roughly, Sweden or England. And one of my creatures is well known to Americans. I claimed that I was allowed to do Mothman because culturally he's Scots-Irish and I'm half Irish. So I started up the Mothman and gave all sorts of reasons why the Mothman would be in your game. I also had Lupetasu, who's a French creature. He's kind of the embodiment of care. And every year he's burnt by the villagers, a bit like that Algrove is it in California, the Algrove, where they burn the embodiment of care? That's it, yeah. I think it's in California.
Is that different than the goat that gets burned down every year accidentally?
Yes.
The accidentally on purpose Swedish goat is different, yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'm not nearly as cultured as you are. Goat.
as mentioned, I've run 266 sessions of Fearful Symmetries. There is an enormous amount of material that didn't go into the game. My players went to Switzerland and Hungary investigating the Black Stone of R.E. Howard fame. They've been to the Dreamlands. There's a whole load of extra stuff, which at some point I'm hoping to get some of this together in a publishable format, or just stuck on C Page XX, which is the Pelgrane in-house magazine. So I'd like to do more stuff.
And in addition, though, you did write Urban Shadows Dark Streets, which is a wonderful extension of Urban Shadows, or pardon me, you participated in it, you didn't write it, per se. I think you also contributed something to Shotguns versus Cthulhu, which is like, yes, slow insanity. What about very fast insanity? Which I kind of like as a contrivance. Did you also participate in Blood on the Snow for Drama System, which is the favorite game system I've never played?
I did. I wrote a setting called Paged, where it's set in a scuzzy street behind the British Museum, and you are all characters who have escaped from fiction in the British Museum and live together in a flat next door to it. My wife wrote the game in there, which is set in the world of Jilly Cooper, which is posh people and horse racing.
That sounds as pulse-pounding as Shotguns versus Cthulhu. Do you have a social media presence that you'd like to share with us?
I do, yeah. I'm on Mastodon.
There's a slight question mark in that, and that is the way that someone should reference Mastodon. I'm on Mastodon?
I'm on Twitter as GB_Steve, and my Mastodon is at GBSteve, no underscore, at dice.camp.
And links to all those will be in the show notes. Steve, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed it.
So Bryce and I are trying a new format where we talk to an author, and rather than interject terminology about a game they have never heard of, we kind of save that for the back half of things. Bryce and I have both gone through Fearful Symmetry in at least some ways, and kind of working our way through, what do you think of the idea of the cosmology of William Blake kind of as a paradigm within Mage? Because, like, to me, one of the first two things that came up is a character who believes that this fits highly into a hermetic worldview, and this is just kind of another sheen on it that no one has investigated. The idea that there is a being that breaks down into four elements, that they are tied to elements. In fact, there is a set of Blakean correspondences that say how each of the Zoas tie to a planet and so on. It just feels like a pretty straightforward thing. And I like the idea that a character goes for the Blakean cosmology because, like, the angels are busy. Like, Raphael and Uriel and Michael. Like, everyone's...
all the other Hermetics are bothering them.
Yeah.
However, if we look over here in the corner, we can see that, Urizen is just sitting there twiddling his thumbs waiting for our call.
Yeah. The other one, to me, is this feels very hollower in the sense that there is this deep romantic modern thing that comes out of somebody's slightly idiosyncratic view, and that it could either be romantic or it could be postmodern, in that someone says, enough people have read this entity is going to answer my call. It is a example of essentially egregore of enough people have read the Blake mythos that this entity exists. I always try and find a hollower angle for things because I like the postmodern view, in the same way that if a character is an archetype, I automatically call them a verbena in some way, shape, or form. Like, to me, Neo is verbena from the Matrix, and people were like, "Durr." I'm like, yeah, it's a pretty standard chosen one narrative. They're simply wearing the great mantle of creation in this thing, and it happens to be technological. But where do you see kind of the mythos, the Blake mythos, or the Zoas, or would have fitting into the world of mage magic, if anywhere?
Either verbena or celestial chorus, right? Because there was the initial one, and then it blew up, devolved, became the rest. I mean, that's the wick. That's the one from the celestial chorus that we're all trying to get back to.
And suddenly we have a character that is looking through the Blake mythos kind of for clues about it, that all the other mythologies of the Shattered First One are so old that we've missed all of it. And maybe you encounter a character, an NPC, who's trying to track down the original Blake notes, who thinks that they may have a read. I do like the wick angle, that there are, as you mentioned, the pure ones that created the wick, that created the Eudina, that created kind of the rest of humanity. And that for whatever reason, Blake had, possibly through it being passed down through generations until he kind of spilled the beans, this information on kind of what those natures of those first creatures were.
I prefer the, just like you said, it's just divine revelation. It came to him out of the blue. This isn't something that he learned from his grandpappy, who learned from his grandpappy on back through the years. This is he was, sunbathing nude in his garden with his wife one day, and the Wick said, "You know what? We need someone to be our messenger on Earth.
Okay.
We've fallen out of favor. So and the Industrial Revolution is coming on. So we need to head that off at the pass if we can. So we're going to get that guy right there."
And it does kind of fit with the chorister notion of not necessarily tying directly with an actual faith. Like the chorus goes back and forth between, is it this kind of cryptic version of Christianity? Does it embrace all faiths? Is it all practitioners of a faith that have kind of taken a step away from orthodoxy? Like we very much get the idea within Sorcerer's Crusade that most even Christian choristers would be considered heretics in the eyes of the Catholic Church.
Well, to be fair, in the Sorcerer's Crusade, everyone south of the Pope was a heretic. Yeah. So that's another easy hurdle to clear.
Yeah. Yeah. I also like the idea of the artifice of this coming from a person's mind, it being kind of revered by maybe a group of marauders or maybe a group of practitioners of crazy wisdom that are like, yes, this is modern divine inspiration. There have been so few people that have been, as you mentioned, touched by the cosmos to reveal this information. I could also see it as an angle for infernalism. You have the fallen and twisted Zoas, you have Loss and Orc, and you have a lot of this very broody, dark magic that is kind of wrapped up around it. Do you think the question of, was Blake a mage, should be answered?
I don't think that the question of was anyone a mage historically should be answered just generically. Yes, in every campaign, Rasputin, he was a mage. No, if it works for your table that he was a mage, yes. If it works for your table that he was a vampire or just a regular dude, that's what happened at your table. I'm not a big fan of claiming historical figures.
Jim Morrison. Still,
I mean, obviously, yes,
he
was a celestial chorister. That's one.
So I also like the idea that the works of Blake are either triggers for awakening, are wonders unto themselves, are essentially nodes that they generally, if you have the Great Red Dragon over the sea, or you have Ancient of Days, that is a node. It generates quintessence or TAS at a certain rate or something like that. I like the idea that the great works are, or important cultural works are in some way still alive. And that if you do have Ancient of Days, though, you do start taking on bits of static resonance. Urizen, the agent of tyrannical order, kind of starts influencing what you do, and suddenly you build up a little bit of rigid resonance, or that is the type of task that this object produces. What do you think of like artistic works being in some way magical?
I like the idea of the artistic work, to steal from my other favorite World of Darkness game, Changeling the Dreaming, the type of dross that you can draw power from, maybe with the mind sphere to get, to align yourself, the creative process that was used to create the art rather than prime.
Kind of the next thing that came through in our conversation was these magical groups in the 1930s. And these to me are pretty fascinating in terms of what they were do. Some of them were end time cults. We have the Ordo Temple Orientalis, Crowley fame that is running around and doing things on this time. We have anthroposophy. There we go. The philosophy of freedom, the idea that there was ethical individualism and that free will is shaped by inner experiences, that the thought and creativity that come through thought left the Theosophic Society, believed that he could directly access the Akashic record. So I like the idea that there is a group of Akashiana that are just generic English guys. And they're like, no, we're in touch with the Akasha. And everyone's like, right.
Are you though?
Yeah. You have the fraternity of Inner Light, which claims to channel a text, the cosmic doctrines from an ascendant master, which is a theosophical term that they kind of took and changed. It had a quasi-Masonic structure to it. Were there any groups that you saw that you kind of thought were particularly interesting, and how would you use them in a game?
I really enjoyed your your scary monster, the liberal Catholic Church that
Ooh.
was created when the one bishop of an offshoot of the Catholic Church said, "No, we're going to do something different real fast," and they just went off on their own, added some theosophical ideas to Catholicism, and said, "Yeah, we believe in most of that except for papal infallibility." Which, as I understand, the Catholic Church is kind of an important part of it.
It's relatively new, though. I didn't realize that the doctrine of papal infallibility was actually, it was voted on by a minority of cardinals, and it occurred in the 19th century.
Oh, well, I guess that would explain why the group that became the liberal Catholic Church was originally the old Catholic Church. Today I learned.
It was defined dogmatically in the First Vatican Council. The idea of it has been around for a while, but us being like, right, put it on the big book. It's part of the rules now. Yep. Sorry, the College of Bishops. It was not voted on by cardinals. My mistake.
But yeah, you could use any of the groups in this game in your Mage game. They're fantastic examples of minor groups that maybe support the Council of Nine, or sorceress groups that your characters have interactions with, or just groups of mortals that you might be looking at. Maybe someday Steve, the member of the Fraternity of the Inner Light, hey, maybe he's going to awaken someday, and he's got some pretty interesting ideas over there.
And I like these being sorceress groups that, like, you have the Path of Inner Light, you have the Church of the Inner Light that has access to the Path of the Inner Light, which is just a reskinning of one of the sorceress paths. I am never quite sure of how to include sorceress groups in Mage. I don't think I've ever successfully done it, but that's a way.
Yeah, just minor magical groups that don't really fit into the traditions, but maybe, I don't know, maybe the traditions use them as allies or monitor them to make sure that they don't turn Nephandic or infernal or whatever.
Do you think there should be a umbral court of the Blakean cosmology? Do you think Albion is running around in the High Umbra? Do you think there is a court of the Zoas that characters can do missions for, as it were?
That's an excellent question. I'm more along the lines of, when it comes to umbral courts, I'm more along the lines of, there is an umbral court, and how you see it depends on your paradigm. So yeah, if you are a firm believer in the mighty Thor and Odin and Loki, then when you go to see the High Umbral Court, it's in a Viking longhouse. It's Asgard. But your friend who's standing next to you, who is a worshiper of, or who believes in the Greek gods or the Roman gods, they're in the same place, they're standing right next to you, but they see it in completely different trappings. So yeah, if you have a character who is who follows the Blakean paradigm, then yeah, absolutely.
I think for me, I would have a spire of Blake. To me, the interesting thing is, generally you are using the umbral spires to get somewhere else, where you have to go from the Vulgate to an elemental court to an umbral court to one of the epiphemies. And my two questions then become, what are the elemental courts that it is above? And what does it lead to? And I could see it being above the elemental courts. This is taking place during the British Industrial Revolution, the court of grain, steam, coal, and wool, or something like that. And that is the elemental spire that it is above that you have to traverse.
It's the elemental spire of Catan.
And, yeah, Brick. God, I hate that game. Anyway.
Me too. It's the least fun board game.
Yeah. And then you have to do something for Luva or Urthona as the blacksmith to advance their agenda before you can get to an epiphany. And to me, the interesting thing about the epiphanies that Blake could be connected to is that kind of anxiety of science and creativity, that it both could get you to the Newtonian epiphany, and probably not the Einsteinian, but also the Inventium, and maybe one of the Verbenus seasonal realms indirectly, that it would have this weird mishmash of connections that would kind of tie to that period of, so what are we losing? And that maybe the area around the Blakean Spire does have some weird cross-section of folkloric creatures kind of in the outlands outside of that spire, and that could lead you to another thing, that you need to find the Devil of Wistmont or something like that. I just assume that that's a folkloric entity. There's probably a half dozen of them. And before you can take a toenail from the Devil of Wistmont or whatever it is, you need to gain the favor of the Umbral Court that surrounds it, that it is around. Otherwise, the bobbies will come for you, or whatever British stereotype you would like to have. I just like the idea of a paradox spirit coming up to you and going, "What's all this then?"
Otherwise, you're in a spot of trouble.
Yeah. The best part is you just have to outrun them because none of them have guns. So that would kind of be my fold in. The other big thing that this gives you is it does give you the Aethirs, which I don't think we've talked about on the show before, are the realms of angels that John Dee kind of outlined and that Aleister Crowley liked to talk more about. And whether or not you want those to be a sub-realm or a zone or something else, I think it is neat to be like, hey, this sorcerer's group that normally can't get into the Umbra seemingly has access to these Aethirs. What does that mean?
Yeah, to the Aethirs, and just the Aethirs. They can't go anywhere else because that'd be, true magic. They can go hang out with, Raphael or Michael or Enion or Luva, but they want to stay away from loss.
But yeah, the book does have a Zoa quick reference handout. It also has a list of all of the Aethirs and what they tie to. It's also nice because it gives us a whole bunch of interconnected realms that aren't just wildly misinterpreting the Sephiroth again. So the other thing the book has is a lot of weird mythical creatures and weird mythical locations that you can just kind of pick up, move over, and put down, like the British questionable relationship with dogs. Apparently, dogs in the UK are quite scary, and they're like, oh, by the way, these may be hounds of Tindalos. I'm like, that changes things. I now understand why they're afraid of dogs.
Yeah, if the only dogs that I were familiar with were the hounds of Tindalos, I would be afraid of chihuahuas too. That tracks, yeah.
The other kind of neat thing this game does systematically is it kind of gives the idea that as you build up scale of an effect, you need to have a certain number of items and elements that tie to both paradigm and what you're trying to do. That you say, okay, this needs an extra point for each area it encompasses, or the number of people, or magnitude of effect. For every 5 of those, I need some sort of link. And that could either be, I need to sacrifice something personally, I need something tied to the effect, or I need something that is magically potent. And at lower levels, that can be something like, oh, I need hawthorn wood to affect this particular kind of creature. At higher levels, it becomes, I need access to pure water that was, or holly that was harvested under the full moon with a silver scythe. And at even higher levels, it's like unicorn blood. And you're like, okay, this is going to change the nature of things. That I totally understand. What do you think of that idea of like kind of requiring more refined focus as the effect gets more potent?
I think that works perfectly well for a lot of paradigms, and surprisingly, given the Blakean nature of this particular book, scientific paradigms. For a general, this will work in the high school science lab kind of thing. Well, whatever, you can just use whatever Bunsen burner they have right there. But if you want to make premium, you're going to need nuclear furnaces or whatever. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah, I like the idea that like when you dictate that an effect requires 10 or 15 or 30 successes or something like that, for each 5 of those successes or something like that, you need an additional element that brings some sort of resonance with your paradigm, with what you're trying to do. And suddenly you can have creatures that are like, yeah, this can only be affected by magic if you already have this or this or something to it. And it neither cuts off your tie to the sphere system as we know it, nor prevents your characters from using magic. It just makes it a little bit more story-y to be involved. Like the sheer number of times in a game of Star Trek, you have to be like, why don't we just solve this with phasers and teleporters? And you're like, it's...
Oh, there's electrical interference in the atmosphere. We can't teleport. That happens a lot.
Yeah.
It happens so much.
The universe by volume is mostly planets with ionization shields around them. The other thing I kind of liked was that set of knobs knobs for character creation and group creation, that there is that covenant. And I like the idea that it's not just the traditions and the technocracy, but there are different magical affiliations around the world, and they kind of have agreements on how things go. And that you get North America or the US and Canada because it's like, yeah, we're not allowed to use magic directly to harm mortals, but we can do it indirectly, so we control the media or something like that.
We kind of sort of have a bit of that. I mean, they've kind of stepped out of the traditions, and the technocracy are the be all end all in the Dragons of the East book when they introduced the five elemental dragons, for instance, as at the time they were presented as an alternative to the technocracy, not necessarily a subsidiary or a minor groups within the technocracy. I know that Mage 20 went back and said, no, that didn't actually happen.
Not only did they go back, they went back and then they called it racist.
I understand that for the purposes of the game, they want to have a big monolithic enemy, and that's the technocracy. And by default, I guess, they decided that there would be a large, maybe not monolithic, but a large group of 9 groups that are the heroes. But there's no reason for that to be the same all around the world, especially since, from first and second edition, one of those 9 groups was all them natives, which is, it's a bit othering and a bit not great.
And I like the idea that you would kind of have this magical concert of Europe, the idea that if any magical group gets too large at a regional level, kind of the other ones put aside their differences for a little bit to knock them back. That in North America, it's the Council versus the technocracy. But in Europe, it is the Society for the Preservation of Ancient Ways versus the People's Modernization Front, or something like that. And in East Asia, you have an appropriate one, and you have something that at different continent levels, and they have various affiliate organizations. And I also like the idea that when your game travels, you're like, oh no, here it is very smoke and mirrors, where in this other portion of the world, no, you can take out the lightning cylinder and unleash a Djinn against someone. If you're comfortable with the paradox, no one's going to yell at you.
The paradigm here is destructive magic.
Yeah.
As long as it blows something up, it is coincidental.
The realm of kaboom. See Bryce and mine conversation on Torg for more information on that. But I kind of like that different areas have different covenants, and that your group may have a treaty of some sort with the local other ones. And with the power of entropy 4 or 5, it could certainly have teeth to it.
Or your group does not have any compact or contact generally with this other group. And when you go to visit, even though nominally paradigmatically they would be your friends, they don't know you. You're a trespasser. You could be here to steal their nodes or, convert their sorceress groups. So they're as much your enemy as the technocracy.
And that kind of reminds me of the way things work in Ars Magica, that the reason mages never really got together is that there was no good magical defense against other magic. So, as you mentioned, like, these compacts are used to kind of rein that in. So anyone who is not bound by it, one suddenly becomes like a free agent, but is also trusted by no one. Kind of any other thoughts on bits that you saw to the game that can be brought into Mage?
The fact that all of William Blake's publishings were basically hand created. So, and then his wife, or he would go in and paint the drawings that were created in there. So no 2 are the same. But because this is his magnum opus, all these works are his work of ritualized magic, those differences may have been intentional to hide some deeper truth, and you would have to get a plethora, if not all of them, together to truly grok what he was putting down on paper. You would have to see the whole picture, as it were, not just the parts. And now here we are 100, 200 and something years later, a lot of those are gone. You cannot get them. So it is literally lost knowledge. But this is Mage. So, I mean, it still exists somewhere. It just might be a tremendous pain in the magical butt to go track down throughout the various Umbrae and time locations, all of this information to get your deeper truth.
And Blake was also tied in with, again, religious observations. So, like, the phrase Ancient of Days has been used as a name of God since the Book of Daniel and probably before. So I like the idea that Blake is just the newest incarnation of those figures, whether or not you want to pull it from Lorianic Kabbalah or from like the Ubusi fresco in Georgia. Like, that title and mantle have existed. So I like the idea that a character has either an avatar in the face of it or an umbral patron, that there is this entity or being that has worn this mantle that is looking to pass it on. And yeah, the subtle variations between the two, like, oh, to pull this off, we need 7 copies of Swole Newton at the bottom of the sea. Again, I need to use that as the show art, because it's just an absolutely ripped Isaac Newton.
You don't know that's not what Isaac Newton looked like.
Correct. You know,
it's not how I picture Isaac Newton, but hey, who am I to say?
But I think there's something rich and interesting here. And listeners, if this episode format worked for you, tell us, and we'll do it again. If it didn't, we won't. That's pretty straightforward in that regard. Anything else come onto your radar recently as anything particularly inspiring for Mage?
About this podcast, A Secret History of Western Esotericism. I gotta subscribe to that, but no, that's about it.
If you could make more headway in it than I could, best to you. It was one of those podcasts where I drifted off by like 4 minutes, and by the time I came back, I'm like, okay, I'm already lost. This is going to require far more brain cells than I can muster. Bryce, thanks for joining.
Terry, as always, thanks for having me.
This has been Mage the Podcast, where if someone claimed to be primordial Albion, we'd be really suspicious, but you know what, man? You do you. This episode was made possible by Oracle Sean Gallagher, who represents Albion's desire for a good lamb curry, Oracle Benjamin Bendelow, who represents Albion's desire for very warm socks, Oracle Buck Gregory, who represents Albion's desire for an efficient tea kettle, Oracle Christopher Phillips, who represents Albion's desire for a better performance base layer when they go out rambling, Oracle Joshua Hillerup, who represents Albion's desire to subdue the wilds of Canada, Oracle Pukuji, who represents Albion's desire to front a really good glam rock band, Oracle Neil Patterson, who represents Albion's desire for vinyl to be not such a thing anymore, Oracle Jay Widener, who represents Albion's desire for a nice Burberry coat, Oracle McHale, who represents Albion's desire for hurling to be a big sport again, and finally, Oracle the Crew of Erebus, who represents Albion's desire. That's it, just Albion's desire. I'd also like to thank Archmaster Andrew Edelstein, Archmaster Brad the Blue, Archmaster Dan Svensson, Archmaster Derek Semsek, Archmaster Guy Conan Stewart, Archmaster Jason Vines, Archmaster Morgan Aran, Archmaster Patrick McNamara, as well as Alex, Alexia, Anders S., Anand, Bedurfi, Berto, Blaze Hibbert, Blake Ryan, Brandon, Bryce Perry, Chris B., Sin Shaddis, Daniel Cuppen, Daniel Scribner, David Roy, Derek Osborne, Eli Levenger, Fragger Rock, George Laura, Ia Bull, Jason Kennedy, Jason W. Briggs, Jay Gatsby, Jeff Bryn, Jenna F., John Magnuson, Jolyn Andes, Lawson Stuff, Joshua Heath, Kathleen Halperin, Chris Kinner, Leslie Weatherstone, Matthew Proyle, Michael Creedle, Michael Parker, Nathan Weaver, Nibero, Nikita Klaimanov, Oliver Schindler, Patrick Mulder, Rachel Grace, Ricardo, Richard Bat Brewster, Robart the Robot, Ryan Stray, Rob H., Ryan Kendi, Samuel Tobin, Schnabelteo Krieger, Stephen Carton, Thrice Great, Vincent Hamilton, William Connolly, William Martin, and Zach Rules. Our EP shoutout this week is to Ryan Stray, and this is a bit of fiction I wrote if every sphere were like mine and had a shield effect as part of its level 1 abilities. Life 1 allows only the elemental introduction to the vast and complicated sphere. So I guess I can only detect life? No, that would be lame. We can catch bullets. Catch bullets? Yes, by creating a life shield you can protect yourself from other life. But catching stray bullets doesn't feel lifey. To study life, one must live, and bullets impede this. Okay, so one exception. Got it. Also thrown cars. What? Yes, the basic understanding that you can increase your strength, stamina, and resiliency. That seems kind of crazy. How? Again, not being effed up when a building drops on you is vital to studying life. This is wisdom from our ancestors. Did they have a lot of buildings dropped on them? No, but their wisdom was so great that they foresaw this. Thank you for your support. Rather listen on YouTube? Search Mage the Podcast on YouTube to find our full library there. If you super like this episode or super didn't, drop us a line at magethepodcast@gmail.com or at magethepodcast on Twitter. We have a hop in Discord community at discord.me/magethepodcast. Mage the Podcast is also on Mastodon at dice.camp/@magethepodcast. If you like us, please give us a review on the platform of your choosing or tell a friend about us. Also go to magethepodcast.com for show notes and all of our previous shows. Now go change reality. Bye.
Do you listen to the Schwepp? The Secret History of Western Esotericism.
I try to. if I try and listen to it and do anything more complicated than walk slowly, I break out in sweats. I even emailed the host one time. They're like, this is our game, but this is what we talk about. And I got a 4-page response that I have been too terrified to go through. I also now want to do a weird Japanese manga Gundam version of this, where Albion is literally like a mecha that has to be assembled from the bots that are the 4 Zoas. I think that's really untapped potential, and that's where we're really going to make bank on this idea. And every day we celebrate that by having intercourse with a cod. That's genius. Okay, added to the show notes. Boom.
Where are you based?
I'm in Philadelphia.
Okay.
So, the one of the oldest cities in America, which is to say, roughly the age of the average rain pail in the UK.
I've been to Philly. I've had a Philly cheesesteak.
That's the experience. You're done.
I did what tourists do.
That's everything. That's all you needed.